Okay, so let's get into our first text for Mod C. As I said, text 1 is a poem and it's called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevens. Let's read it together. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only thing moving was the eye of the blackbird. I was of 3 minds, like a tree in which there are 3 blackbirds. The blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. O thin man of Hedem, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the women about you? I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms, but I know too that the blackbird is involved in what I know. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. At the sight of blackbirds flying in a green light, even the birds of euphony would cry out sharply. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once a fear pierced him in that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing, and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs. Okay, so very quickly, you've got quite a really interesting and very abstract kind of poem, which gives us a lot to play with for Module C. In terms of where we're going to start, it's always important to have a quick consideration of context, because we've talked extensively, Year 12, about how significant context is. It gives us such greater insight into the meaning of texts. When we look at the context, all of those things that are impacting and shaping what's being represented in a text. So very, very quickly, again, I'm not going to read through this word for word. You're very capable of doing that by yourselves. But I'm going to quickly step you through some key points here, just for the sake of time. Your authorial context here, Wallace Stevens was born in Pennsylvania. He's an American, obviously, just around the cusp of the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century. He was born into a Lutheran family. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of religious kind of context here, but the Lutherans are traditionally very strict in their religiosity and very, very, very structured in terms of their approach to their religion. He was also part of a very wealthy family. He was the son of a lawyer. He studied at Harvard himself. He went off to New York Law School, following in his father's footsteps, and also his 2 older brothers, supposedly, and spent much of his life, interestingly, working as an executive officer for insurance companies. And I love that about Wallace Stevens. He is one of our really great writers of the 20th century, and he spends most of his life working in the opposite sphere, in that very numbers-based world. And as I said to you before, sometimes we've got these kind of split brains, and some of us lean towards, that logical, that rational kind of part of our brain that processes everything black and white. And that's why some students really struggle with English, because it's so grey and there's so much open to interpretation. But I love this about Stevens. He was himself very black and white, obviously, very much logical, numbers-based man. And it was only through a relationship with a philosopher, a friend of his, that he actually kind of explored a little bit more about his own thinking, and that really propelled some of his writing, which he'd only ever done as a hobby. As you can see there in his blurb, he ended up winning and becoming quite an acclaimed writer very late in his life, just before he passed away, actually, winning the Pulitzer Prize. So he's become, quite highly regarded, perhaps more so later and even once he passed away than he was when he was first writing. In terms of a literary context, as I mentioned already, this falls within, as we know, that modernist realm of context. We've talked extensively, particularly if you've been in my Year 11 class, about so many significant events happening in humanity around the turn of the 20th century. This is when Wallace Stevens was living and experiencing his own life. He has been regarded as one of the best American poets of this time. Interestingly, he doesn't fall just in a modernist realm. He did explore with different styles and certainly has strong romanticist links. So that's kind of the century or so before his lifetime, and he draws extensively upon the very famous romantic poetry, which again, if you remember, we looked at in narratives, remembering the poem that we studied alongside Othello, had very strong romantic links, and that kind of context certainly is very important here when you're looking at Wallace Stevens. Alongside that, obviously, focus upon the Blackbird. There's a lot of great literature around birds. Now, I'm not saying you have to write about birds. I wouldn't personally write about birds. I'm not a bird fan at all. But there's quite a strong collection of poetry out of this time, particularly the likes of Keats, as you can see there. Down here, very importantly, it was published in his first collection, this particular poem. It wasn't greatly successful to start with, and again, I kind of like that about this text, but it became much more highly regarded as we kind of continue to evolve in our understanding of Wallace Stevens' writing. There is no great consensus, Year 12, about what this poem is actually about. And again, while that might really bother some of you who like that very obvious literal interpretation, I love it when we're forced to think. And the ambiguity here, I really love, and I'm quite drawn to this text for that reason. I love that we're not told what it means. And that really forces us to consider what we think about his ideas and his language. So he described it himself as a collection of sensations, a group of poems. So he didn't really classify it himself as one poem, but he was more of the belief that it was like 13 little poems that kind of he just put together into this collection. And it's an interesting interpretation when you start to look at it more closely. Lots of his poems, as it says there, critics were debating over the meaning. He liked the ambiguity, and as a writer, that's probably something you want. You want people talking about, well, what do you think that means? Again, in your own writing, don't tell us everything. Leave us to ponder and force us to consider and reflect on what you're writing. I think that's a really important element. The fragmented style, the breaking it into sections, again, might be elements that you come back to consider in your own writing. There's often links here, as it says in the notes, to the Japanese poetic form you've probably studied in junior years, I imagine, the haiku, which is that very style based on the number of syllables per line. It's a bit of a fun poetic form to play around with. Stevens didn't necessarily align with that per se, but he did acknowledge that there was some sort of playing around with some elements of structure here in his poem. Okay. Historical context, we don't need to go into great detail here. We've looked a lot at this historical context already through our studies in Year 11. You've got a big shift in life perspective, obviously, between the two world wars, lots of questioning, lots of uncertainty, lots of ambiguity, lots of searching for the meaning of life. The Blackbird here, again, could be a very broad reference to an array of birds. Don't think it necessarily is a literal blackbird, but there is some symbolic references there as it's discussed in the notes. Very importantly, summary. Let's look very quickly at a summary so that you understand really what the essence of the poem is about. It's looking, I guess, in essence, at 13 differing or unique perspectives on a particular element. All right? And I really think you need to understand how important that notion of perspective is in this text, and that's kind of what I want you to consider. the notion that perspective is always multifaceted, the way that we have to be flexible in our perspective. We have to adapt and change and view things from different, viewpoints. That's a really important element here. 13 pictures, obviously, around the Blackbird, describing elements of this Blackbird, all of it very disjointed, perhaps, and as you probably were reading and processing that when I was reading it initially, it's probably a little confusing. And again, I kind of like that about this text. We've already talked about him saying he says it's not meant to be read as one, but kind of a collection of sensations. And again, you can decide how you align with that in terms of the structure. Obviously, as I mentioned, quite abstract, quite ambiguous, keeping readers at a distance, and really, basically, as it says there, resisting the intelligence, making the reader work to understand. And again, that enhances our engagement with the text. So think about that in your own writing. Simple language. Nothing in this is particularly complex. There's nothing that's really hard to understand. And again, in your own writing, think about that. You don't have to try to be too smart. You don't have to be superfluous in the way that you're writing some deep, complex meaning. It can be quite simplistic, but quite impacting through that style of language. I love that quote that Stevens wrote. Poetry is a response to the daily necessity of getting the world right. And I wonder what that means for you in terms of your own thinking around getting the world right, how our writing can be a response to our own processing of the world and trying to make sense of this crazy experience of life. Short minimalist sketches. I love the episodic sort of style here, the fragmented nature. And again, you might play around and experiment with some of that. I'll probably force you to do some of that writing, just as a heads up. 13 Ways concludes with the speaker returning to a snowy day. So it starts in a natural landscape and finishes in a natural landscape, the snowy world. And again, that cyclical sort of circular structure is a really great example of language that you can tap into. Linking your opening and your closing is a really simple but quite impacting feature of writing. Summarising, it says there, the poet's exercise of looking at a blackbird in 13 different ways highlights humanity's loss of direct contact with the natural world. Now, this is just an interpretation. It's not my interpretation necessarily, but it's just a perspective. And the critic who I borrowed these notes from mentioned that. That's just one interpretation of this text. It doesn't have to be your interpretation, and that's the beauty of English. We've got these multifaceted kind of layers of interpretation, putting human lives out of sync, whereas the blackbird is where he needs to be and always has been. So again, your interpretation, as it says there, can differ quite remarkably from that particular perspective. Alrighty, let's jump into some more close analysis of Stevens's language.